France, late summer 1943. The sky is a pale, endless canvas streaked with contrails and gun smoke. Below, the countryside is burning. Black plumes climb toward the heavens like ghosts of the villages bombed hours earlier. High above, two Messerschmitt Bf-109s glide through thin air, engines humming smoothly. Their pilots, veterans of dozens of kills, spot movement below, a single, bulky American fighter struggling to climb. One laughs through his oxygen mask. Langsam is too slow. To them, the newcomer is a lumbering brute too large, too heavy, too late to threaten the Luftwaffe's supremacy. They dive. Cannons ready. But as they close in, the slow American fighter suddenly tilts upward, its engine roaring with a sound they've never heard before. The silver plane shoots vertically into the sky, leaving the Germans gasping. Their altimeters spin. Their engines choke in the thinning air. Within seconds, the American plane, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, vanishes into the sun, outclimbing them effortlessly. For the first time, the Luftwaffe aces realize this heavy beast can fly higher, faster, and longer than they ever imagined, and the war in the air will never feel the same again. In early 1942, the air over Europe was still a German domain. The Luftwaffe, forged in the lightning wars of Poland, France, and the early battles over Britain, remained one of the most experienced and feared air forces on Earth. Its sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s had carved their legend in contrails and flames. Each sortie seemed to confirm German mastery of the sky fast, agile fighters diving from altitude, shredding slower Allied bombers before disappearing into the clouds. Across the Channel, the Royal Air Force held its ground in defense, but for the Americans, who had only recently entered the war, the skies of Europe were a nightmare waiting to unfold. When the U.S. Army Air Forces began daylight bombing raids in 1942, they did so with optimism and vulnerability. Their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators could carry tons of explosives deep into occupied territory, but they had no escort that could stay with them beyond the French coast. Once the bombers crossed into German-controlled airspace, the Luftwaffe fighters descended like hawks, tearing through formations that stretched for miles. Losses mounted fast. Entire squadrons failed to return. In some missions, 1 out of every 3 bombers vanished. Commanders at the 8th Air Force headquarters in England knew the problem: range. Their existing fighters, the P-38 Lightning and the P-39 Airacobra, lacked the fuel endurance to accompany bombers all the way to their targets and back. They needed something new. A fighter that could climb high, hit hard, and endure the freezing thin air above 30,000 feet. But there was a dilemma: speed versus strength. In air combat, lighter meant faster. Yet, to reach higher altitudes and escort bombers deep into Europe, an aircraft needed a massive engine, oxygen systems, and large fuel tanks. Every pound added slowed the plane, and every gain in speed reduced the range. While engineers debated, pilots paid the price. By late 1942, American fighter pilots were flying into a storm with outdated tools. The Luftwaffe met them with precision, discipline, and years of experience. The FW-190 in particular was devastating. Its radial engine offered tremendous climb rate and stability, and its cannons could tear apart bombers with a few hits. The U.S. needed an answer fast. In a quiet factory in Farmingdale, New York, the Republic Aviation Corporation was already working on one. Their chief engineer, Alexander Kartveli, had designed an aircraft so large and so unconventional that many thought it was absurd. Its prototype, designated XP-47B, looked like no fighter before it. Thick fuselage, huge propeller, and an engine so powerful that the plane's nose seemed to barely contain it. When test pilots first saw it, they laughed. "It's not a fighter," one said. "It's a flying tank." Even within the U.S. Army Air Forces, doubts ran deep. The plane weighed over 7 tons fully loaded, nearly twice as heavy as the nimble Spitfire. Its wings were wide and curved, its cockpit perched high like a turret, but Kartveli had a vision that few yet understood. He wasn't designing for speed alone. He was designing for survival for a war fought high above Europe, where thin air and freezing temperatures made ordinary engines gasp for power. At the heart of his creation was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower beast paired with a General Electric turbo supercharger. The turbo system, tucked deep within the fuselage, forced compressed air into the engine even at extreme altitudes. It gave the plane the lungs to breathe and the power to climb higher than any piston fighter before it. Still, skeptics remained unconvinced. When early models rolled out in mid-1942, they were slow to accelerate, heavy on the controls, and difficult to maneuver. In mock dogfights, the P-47 seemed clumsy compared to the elegant Spitfire or the deadly Messerschmitt. Reports circulated among American pilots: too big for combat, too slow to turn, useless against the 190. Even German intelligence took note, mocking the new American machine in their internal memos. But while the world laughed, Republic engineers kept refining their design. Each flight brought new lessons. Each engine test revealed new potential. And as winter turned to spring in 1943, the air war over Europe was about to meet its most misunderstood weapon. The flying tank was ready for battle, and soon, it would silence its critics at 30,000 feet. By early 1943, the airfields of southern England were crowded with olive-drab aircraft and restless pilots. The 8th Air Force was expanding fast, and among the new arrivals stood a machine few believed in: the Republic P-47C Thunderbolt. Its presence was impossible to ignore. Mechanics joked that the Thunderbolt was built around its engine. Its landing gear was thick, its fuselage enormous, its propeller nearly 12 feet wide. Compared to the sleek Spitfires parked nearby, it looked like a beast from another era. The pilots who climbed into its cockpit quickly discovered the truth. This was no gentle aircraft. The controls were heavy, the takeoffs rough, and visibility was limited by the massive nose. One careless throttle push and the torque could flip the plane off the runway. Still, there was something thrilling about it. When the R-2800 engine came alive, the air vibrated. The roar was unlike anything else in the European theater, a deep, metallic growl that shook the ground. In March 1943, the 4th Fighter Group veterans who had once flown Spitfires with the RAF's Eagle squadrons became the first American unit to take the Thunderbolt into combat. Their early missions were simple: short-range sweeps across northern France, intercepting enemy aircraft when possible. The results were mixed. Many pilots returned frustrated, complaining that the Thunderbolt climbed too slowly and guzzled fuel. Its radio system caused interference with the engine's ignition, leading to sudden static and lost communication mid-battle. Several aircraft were lost not to the enemy, but to mechanical faults and weather. German pilots who encountered it were unimpressed. The Luftwaffe's reports called the P-47 massiv und schwerfällig, massive und cumbersome. In the mess halls of occupied France, they laughed that America had built a bomber pretending to be a fighter. But then, the high-altitude missions began. The Thunderbolt's design came alive above 20,000 feet, where other fighters gasped for air. The P-47's turbo-supercharged engine kept breathing. Its acceleration sharpened, its power curve steadied, and it could now reach speeds exceeding 420 miles per hour, faster than many German interceptors at altitude. When the Luftwaffe tried to dive away, they discovered something unexpected. The Thunderbolt could dive faster than anything else in the sky. Its heavy frame gave it terrifying momentum. Pilots reported that in steep dives, the airspeed indicator would spin past 500 miles per hour, and the controls stiffened until they could barely pull out. But those who mastered it realized the Thunderbolt could use its weight as a weapon. Soon, tactics changed. Instead of tight-turning fights, P-47 pilots adopted boom and zoom diving from high altitude, firing quick bursts, and climbing back to the heavens before the enemy could react. In the words of one pilot, "You didn't dance with a Thunderbolt, you struck and vanished." The German mockery began to fade after the first few encounters. 190 pilots found themselves unable to catch the P-47 once it started climbing. The Luftwaffe's advantage in agility no longer mattered if they couldn't reach the same altitude. Back in England, confidence began to grow. The Thunderbolt squadrons painted fierce nose art on their planes, jagged teeth, smoking guns, and bold names like Misfire or Hairless Joe. Each sortie brought new lessons. Engineers fixed the radio problems, improved the cockpit heating, and refined the propeller. By mid-1943, the P-47 had escorted bombers deeper into France than any American fighter before it. And as the Allies prepared for the long push into occupied Europe, the slow fighter was slowly earning its place in the sky. Still, its greatest test had yet to come: the deep raids over Germany itself, where hundreds of bombers flew into flak-filled skies and where the Luftwaffe's best waited in ambush. The Thunderbolt would have to prove not just that it could climb, but that it could survive. By the summer of 1943, the airfields of East Anglia buzzed with the sound of Thunderbolts warming up for missions that stretched deeper into enemy territory than ever before. Every sortie began with a roar that echoed through the hedgerows and for the men strapped inside. Each flight was an act of faith in a machine most of them had once doubted. Many American pilots had come from lighter, more agile aircraft, the P-40 Warhawk, the Spitfire, or even the twin-engine P-38. The Thunderbolt felt alien by comparison. Its cockpit sat high, offering visibility like a fortress tower. The engine heat could reach unbearable levels on the ground, but at 25,000 feet the world outside was a frozen void. Flying the Jug, one pilot wrote, was like wrestling a bear, but if you learned to work with it, the bear fought for you. Training was relentless. Pilots practiced high-speed dives, recovery from compressibility, and long-range navigation over featureless seas. They learned to trust the plane's ruggedness, its ability to take hits and still bring them home. Stories began to circulate through the squadrons. A Thunderbolt returning with a cylinder shot out still flying, another limping home with holes the size of a man's head through its fuselage. Some even landed with parts of their tail missing, the pilot bruised but alive. Soon confidence replaced skepticism. The pilots began calling their aircraft by a new name, the Jug. Short for Juggernaut, it perfectly captured its unstoppable, unbreakable, unrelenting personality. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to turn fight with the Messerschmitts or Spitfires. Its massive weight made tight maneuvers impossible, but what it lacked in agility it compensated with speed, altitude, and power. The new doctrine was simple: boom and zoom. From 30,000 feet, the P-47s would dive on unsuspecting enemies below, unleash their .850 caliber machine guns, and climb back to safety before the Germans could react. The roar of those guns was unmistakable. Each wing carried 4 Browning M2s, capable of firing over 100 rounds per second combined. German pilots learned to fear that sound. A burst from a Thunderbolt could tear a fighter apart in an instant, or shred a bomber's engines before it could scatter. Soon, the Thunderbolt's tactics expanded beyond escort duty. They began flying fighter sweeps, hunting Luftwaffe formations before they could reach Allied bombers. Squadrons like the 56th Fighter Group, led by men such as Hub Zemke and Francis Gabreski, mastered the art of high-altitude ambush. Zemke's Wolfpack, as they were called, became legends. They understood the P-47's strengths, its power in a dive, its stability at speed, and its sheer resilience. They struck from above, disengaged at will, and climbed higher than the pursuing Messerschmitts could follow. To the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt was an enigma. At first, they dismissed it as another Allied experiment destined to fail. But by late 1943, reports began flooding Luftwaffe intelligence offices. The American fighter with radial engine outclasses at high altitude impossible to catch and dive. German pilots noticed something else. The P-47 could take punishment no Bf-109 could survive. One Luftwaffe ace, after a close engagement over Belgium, reported watching a Thunderbolt he had riddled with cannon shells continue climbing, oil pouring from its cowling, flames licking the fuselage yet still shooting back. It flew like a machine that refused to die, he wrote. In the pilots' lounges of northern France, the laughter about the flying bathtub began to quiet. Respect replaced mockery. They still feared the nimble Spitfire, but the Thunderbolt carried a different kind of menace, slow to start, impossible to stop. For American crews, that invincibility bred a fierce sense of loyalty. Many Thunderbolt pilots spoke about their aircraft as if it were a living comrade. They decorated it, named it, personalized it: Tinker Bell, 7-11, Spirit of Ruth. Each return to base was a small miracle. The ground crews counted bullet holes, patched metal with sheet and rivets, and sent the aircraft back up again. It was a rhythm of trust, man and machine, against the frozen vastness of war. They began to understand something deeper. The P-47 wasn't just a fighter. It was a psychological weapon. Its presence reassured bomber crews, a hulking guardian roaring alongside them, ready to strike down any attacker. For the Germans, it was a reminder that America's industrial power could now reach even the upper edges of the stratosphere. By the winter of 1943, Thunderbolts escorted bombers beyond the Rhine, striking at German railways, factories, and airfields. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, began to feel hunted. Every mission showed that the balance was shifting. The Germans still had skill, still had courage, but their numbers were thinning, their fuel scarce, and their engines struggling to perform at the altitudes where the P-47 thrived. The Americans had found their high-altitude hammer. And soon, the Luftwaffe would face something it had not felt since the early days of the war: helplessness. Behind every great aircraft of the Second World War stood a team of engineers who defied the limits of their time. For the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, that mind was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born immigrant who understood better than most what industrial perseverance could achieve. When he first presented the P-47's blueprints to the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1940, they were unlike anything seen before. While most fighter designs aimed for lightness and agility, Kartveli's concept was built around one idea: power at altitude. At the center of the P-47's success was its Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing over 2,000 horsepower. But the real genius was what lay behind it: a General Electric turbo supercharger system, running through a complex network of ducts and intercoolers stretching nearly the full length of the fuselage. This system captured exhaust gases from the engine, spun a turbine to compress incoming air, and fed it back, allowing the engine to maintain sea-level power even at 30,000 feet. It was a technological marvel, years ahead of its rivals. Most European fighters used simple mechanical superchargers that lost efficiency as altitude increased. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, grew stronger the higher it climbed. Its performance curve inverted expectations. Where other fighters gasped, the jug surged, but engineering brilliance came at a cost. The turbo system was heavy, complex, and required intricate maintenance. The P-47's fuselage had to be enormous just to fit it all. Critics called it overbuilt until combat proved otherwise. That complexity gave the Thunderbolt a unique personality in flight. At low altitudes, it felt sluggish and unresponsive, the airframe burdened by its own weight, but above 20,000 feet the aircraft transformed. The turbo roared alive, the propeller bit deeper into the thin air, and the P-47 climbed like a beast unleashed. This characteristic made it ideal for the European theater, where bomber formations flew at 25,000 feet or higher. It was here, not in low-level skirmishes, that the jug was designed to rule. If the Thunderbolt had a defining trait beyond its engine, it was its sheer toughness. The aircraft's airframe was built from the strongest aluminum alloys available, its wings thick and reinforced, its cockpit protected by armor plating and bulletproof glass. The self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb direct hits and still hold together long enough to bring the pilot home. It became common for returning Thunderbolts to land with engines shot out, landing gear half deployed or with entire sections of the tail missing yet still under control. This resilience saved hundreds of lives and gave pilots a psychological edge. In the cruel calculus of air war, survivability often meant victory. As the P-47 began to prove itself, America's wartime factories roared into motion. Republic Aviation in New York, followed by Curtiss-Wright in Buffalo and Evansville, turned out Thunderbolts by the thousands. By 1944, one P-47 rolled off the assembly line every 90 minutes. The numbers told a story beyond technology. They revealed industrial power. Each Thunderbolt was a flying testament to America's ability to mass-produce precision engineering on a scale the Axis could no longer match. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's factories were shrinking under relentless Allied bombing. Every destroyed factory, every broken railway line made it harder for Germany to replace its aircraft. The P-47's existence was not just a military weapon, it was an industrial message. As the war advanced into 1944, the Thunderbolt's role began to evolve. It was no longer just a high-altitude escort, it became a multi-role fighter bomber, striking enemy targets across Western Europe. Engineers fitted it with bomb racks and rocket mounts. Suddenly, the same aircraft that could duel a Messerschmitt at 30,000 feet could also dive-bomb tanks and trains at treetop level. This flexibility transformed Allied air strategy. Before the P-47, the U.S. Army Air Forces relied on separate aircraft for different roles. Now one platform could fight, escort, and attack ground targets, simplifying logistics and expanding options. Thunderbolts began flying train-busting runs, tearing through German supply lines, destroying locomotives, convoys, and bridges. With 8 50-caliber machine guns and up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, a single P-47 could devastate an entire column of trucks or armored vehicles. Even the German panzer divisions, once symbols of unstoppable force, learned to dread the low growl of a thunderbolt overhead. The rise of the P-47 changed how the Allies fought the air war. No longer confined to defensive escort, American fighters could now control the battle's altitude and direction. They dictated when to engage, when to retreat, and when to attack the enemy's lifelines on the ground. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin, struggled to respond. Every attempt to climb and intercept the bombers now risked ambush by thunderbolts waiting above. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt was proving what its designer had promised. It could outclimb and outdive any German fighter at high altitude. And for the first time since the Blitz, German skies were no longer safe. The laughter that once echoed through Luftwaffe hangars had turned into unease. A fighter they had dismissed as slow and clumsy was now dictating the rhythm of the war in the air. But the true test, the one that would cement its place in aviation history, was yet to come. The great air battles over Germany in 1944, where hundreds of Thunderbolts faced the full force of the Reich's defenses. Winter, 1944. The skies over Europe were no longer silent. Every morning the dull hum of engines grew into a roar that shook the earth as waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators lifted off from English airfields. Their mission? To bomb the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, the factories of Regensburg, the rail yards of Frankfurt, the oil refineries of Merseburg and Schweinfurt. It was a campaign designed to cripple the Reich's ability to wage war. But it came at a cost. The Luftwaffe had reorganized its defenses, pulling back its best fighter groups to defend the homeland. They waited along predictable bomber routes, ready to strike with Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs and FW-190A-8s, each armed with 20mm cannons and deadly 30mm shells. At the start of these raids, bomber losses were staggering. The air over Germany turned into a maelstrom of smoke and fire. Entire formations vanished under coordinated German attacks, but this time the bombers weren't alone. Riding high above them, almost invisible in the frozen sunlight, flew the Thunderbolts. On August 17, 1943, during the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, the P-47 made its mark. While the bombers pushed deep into Bavaria, Luftwaffe interceptors swarmed in waves, aiming to break the American formations apart. The first Thunderbolt squadrons to engage found themselves outnumbered, but not outclassed. At 25,000 feet, the P-47s dove into the German formations, guns blazing. Their 8 Brownings tore through enemy ranks, the air filled with the rattle of machine guns, the hiss of cannon shells, and the glow of tracer fire. Captain Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, radioed calmly to his men. "Don't turn with them. Dive and climb. Use your weight. Hit them hard and go." His tactic worked. German pilots who tried to follow found their engines choking in the thin air. Their controls stiffened. Their climb angles failed. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolts powered back upward, engines screaming as their turbo superchargers forced life into every cylinder. That day, Zemke's group claimed 17 German fighters destroyed for the loss of just a handful of Thunderbolts. It was a small victory in a long war, but the message was clear. The Luftwaffe could no longer dominate at altitude. In Luftwaffe operations reports, a new tone emerged, not of ridicule but of frustration. Pilots complained that the American radial-engined fighters could dive faster than anything they had ever seen. Several aces, including Gerhard Barkhorn and Günther Rauh, noted that pursuing a Thunderbolt in a dive often led to fatal compressibility, the controls locking solid as the aircraft approached the speed of sound. The Germans had discovered the hard way that the Thunderbolt was a machine with no natural prey. At low altitude, it was dangerous. At medium altitude, it was equal. At high altitude, it was supreme. The Luftwaffe's doctrine, once based on intercepting bombers freely, now had to change. Fighters that climbed to engage were picked off by thunderbolts waiting above. Those that dove to escape found the P-47s following them into terminal velocity. And in every combat report, one detail stood out. The American fighters didn't break apart. Where a single cannon shell could disintegrate a Spitfire, the P-47s came home full of holes. Some landed with their wings shredded, others missing parts of their tail. Yet their pilots climbed out alive. The flying tank reputation had become legend. Through the first months of 1944, the Thunderbolt fought alongside the newly introduced P-51 Mustang, together forming the backbone of the Allied escort force. But while the Mustang eventually took over the longest-range missions, it was the P-47 that broke the Luftwaffe's back. The spring raids on German industry became battles of attrition. Every time the Luftwaffe scrambled its interceptors, the Thunderbolts met them head-on. The results were devastating. Fuel depots burned. Fighter bases were strafed into rubble. German losses began to climb to unsustainable levels. By March, some Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings, reported losing half their aircraft within a single month. In combat logs, Luftwaffe commanders began writing the same grim words. No replacements, no fuel, no rest. What had begun as ridicule of a slow American fighter had turned into desperation. On one bitter morning over central Germany, a group of FW-190s attempted to climb and intercept a formation of B-17s at 25,000 feet. From above, unseen against the sun, a flight of Thunderbolts waited. They dove. In less than a minute, 5 German aircraft were burning in the sky. One pilot parachuted his canopy opening just in time to watch a Thunderbolt climb vertically past him, still firing. When he was captured later that day, he told his interrogator something that echoed through intelligence reports. We laughed when we first saw them. We don't laugh anymore. The air war over Germany had changed forever. What once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the high-altitude roar of American engines. But the Thunderbolt's most defining moment, its transformation into a ground-dominating weapon that crippled the German war machine from below, was still to come, spring 1944. Across southern England, thousands of aircraft stood ready on steel-plated runways, the airfields buzzing with anticipation. The Allies were preparing for the greatest invasion in history. Among them, lined up in endless rows under camouflage nets, sat the unmistakable silhouettes of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Their radial engines glistened with oil. Their thick fuselages looked almost brutish compared to the sleek Mustangs beside them. But to those who had flown them, the Thunderbolt wasn't ugly, it was invincible. Before the invasion of Normandy, the U.S. Army Air Forces unleashed their fighter bombers on France's roads, bridges, and railways. The goal was simple: paralyze German movement. Each Thunderbolt now carried 500-pound bombs, 5-inch rockets, and even napalm tanks, weapons that turned it from a dogfighter into a flying artillery platform. Every mission began the same way. Engines coughed to life one after another, echoing across the countryside like rolling thunder. Pilots strapped in, often painting names or pin-up girls on their cowls: Tallahassee Lassie, Juggernaut, Sleepy Time Gal. As they took off, the roar shook the hedgerows. Ground crews covered their ears, watching the Jugs climb toward the channel, their wingtips glinting in the dawn light. June 6, 1944, D-Day. While paratroopers fought in the fields below, the Thunderbolts swarmed the skies. Their mission: keep every German unit pinned, every road choked with wreckage. Whenever German armor tried to move toward the beaches, the P-47s arrived. They dove almost vertically, guns blazing, 850 caliber machine guns cutting through tanks, trucks and half-tracks like a chainsaw through wood. One after another, columns of German armor burned in the bocage. The roar of the Thunderbolts became as feared as any artillery barrage. Pilots described the sensation of diving from 12,000 feet as riding a thunderbolt to earth. At full throttle, the cockpit shook, the altimeter spun wildly, and the gun sight flashed red as tracers found their mark. By the end of the first week, entire panzer divisions reported being harassed without pause from the air. Luftwaffe ground crews watched helplessly as their once mighty fighter force crumbled. Fuel shortages kept many aircraft grounded. The few that did scramble were often shot down before reaching altitude. German soldiers on the ground began calling the P-47 Der brüllende Tod, the screaming death. Its dive attack came with a howl, the sound of air rushing through its turbocharger ducts moments before bombs exploded. Captured German officers later admitted that the psychological effect of Thunderbolt attacks was devastating. One Wehrmacht colonel described it bluntly. You could fight soldiers. You could face tanks, but you could not fight the jugs. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt had found its perfect hunting ground: low-altitude combat. Flying barely a few hundred feet above the ground, P-47 strafed rail lines, bridges, and truck convoys with terrifying precision. In Belgium, during the Battle of the Bulge, entire German supply columns were annihilated by Thunderbolt strikes. They attacked in pairs or fours, one strafing, the other covering. In less than 10 minutes, a road could be transformed into a corridor of twisted steel and burning fuel. The Luftwaffe tried to fight back with the new Me-262 jet, but even these futuristic aircraft couldn't change the tide. There were too few of them, and the Thunderbolts owned the airspace below 20,000 feet. Every mile the German army retreated, the P-47s followed, turning each crossroads, each bridge, each supply depot into rubble. By 1945, the Jug, as its pilots affectionately called it, had become one of the most respected aircraft of the entire war. It wasn't graceful, but it was unkillable. It wasn't elegant, but it was unstoppable. One squadron commander joked, "You could fill it with holes, set it on fire, and it'd still bring you home for dinner." Records proved him right. Hundreds of P-47s returned from missions with oil leaking, wings shredded, canopies shot away, yet their pilots survived. The Luftwaffe's fear had evolved into awe. Reports captured by Allied intelligence described pilots begging for better armor and warning that American fighters now rule every altitude. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the air war was over. Thunderbolts roamed freely across Germany, attacking anything that moved: trains, barges, even retreating infantry columns. The same aircraft once mocked as too big and too slow had become the most dominant strike fighter of the European theater. From the skies above Normandy to the ruins of Berlin, the roar of the P-47 marked the sound of Germany's defeat. As one German officer later said during interrogation, "When we saw the Thunderbolts, we knew the day was lost. The war was ending, but the legend was just beginning." The P-47 Thunderbolt had outflown mockery, outlasted rivals, and outgunned its enemies. It had turned from an underdog into the very symbol of American air power, a machine forged not for beauty, but for victory. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the skies over Europe were strangely peaceful. The trails of vapor, the roar of engines, the dance of pursuit are all gone. What remained were the machines themselves, parked in neat rows across captured airfields, silent under the morning mist. Among them stood the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, its once gleaming aluminum skin dulled by months of war. Bullet holes were patched with sheet metal, gun barrels blackened from thousands of rounds. Yet even in stillness it carried the aura of strength, the kind of power that had changed the tide of the air war. By the end of World War II, more than 15,600 Thunderbolts had been built, more than any other American fighter. They flew over 1 million sorties, destroyed thousands of German aircraft, and obliterated enemy ground targets with unmatched efficiency. In Europe, the P-47 became the backbone of the fighter-bomber command, while in the Pacific it served with equal distinction, strafing Japanese shipping and defending long-range bombers. Its pilots recorded 3,152 confirmed aerial victories, but its true impact lay in something harder to count: the destruction of German mobility, morale, and will to fight. Every bridge destroyed, every convoy wrecked, every supply line shattered, all helped shorten the war by months. And through it all, the P-47 earned a reputation unmatched for survivability. No Allied fighter brought more damaged pilots home. The German perspective. After the war, captured Luftwaffe officers were interviewed about their experiences. Many expressed admiration for the American air campaign and particular respect for the Thunderbolt. One former FW-190 pilot confessed, "We laughed at it once. But when it climbed past us, when it dived faster than we could follow, we stopped laughing." Another added quietly, "It was like fighting a tank with wings." To the Germans, The Thunderbolt symbolized the industrial might of the United States. The idea that war could be won not only by tactics but by endurance, production, and relentless innovation. The pilots who flew it for the men who flew the jug, it was more than just a machine. It was a lifeline. Many described it as a friend that refused to let them die, a beast that took punishment no human could endure. When they stepped down from its cockpit after battle, their faces streaked with oil and sweat, they often reached back and patted its fuselage like a living creature. In memoirs decades later, veterans still spoke of its sound. The thunderous growl of that massive Pratt & Whitney engine was a noise that meant safety to Allied troops below and terror to the enemy. The Thunderbolt's success reshaped aviation design. Its combination of armor, firepower, and power plant engineering laid the foundation for modern ground attack aircraft. The U.S. Air Force's later designs, from the Korean War's F-84 to the Cold War's A-10 Thunderbolt II, carried its lineage proudly in both name and spirit. Even today, the A-10 with its titanium armor and cannon roar is affectionately known as the Warthog. But to those who know history, it's simply the descendant of the P-47, another beast that takes the hits and keeps fighting. In the end, the story of the Thunderbolt is not about elegance or grace. It's about endurance, about a machine that was mocked for its size, dismissed for its speed, and doubted by its own creators until the day it proved them all wrong. It became a reminder that war does not always reward beauty. It rewards resilience. As the war historian Martin Kaiden once wrote, the P-47 was never the fastest to turn or the first to climb, but it always came home, and that in the end was all that mattered. Over the ruined cities of Europe and the quiet airfields of peace, its thunder slowly faded. But its legend, the laughter it silenced, the courage it carried still echoes through time, because sometimes the slowest fighter doesn't just survive, it outclimbs them all.